Algebra 2. The first thing I want to make sure that you write in for tonight's notes is on the back of your Day 3 notes. I want you to write in what we talked about in class today. And that was answering the question of, can I factor the sum of two squares? And remember from our warm-up we had the problem 9 plus b squared. And remember we talked about the different options but realized that it's not factorable, it would be prime. So you're answering your question of the sum of two squares that no, I cannot factor them, the sum of two squares are prime. We can factor a difference of two squares but not a sum. So this example that we did in the warm-up shows that it is prime. Tonight's notes are factoring by grouping, and it's our last notes. Our learning target for these notes is I can factor trinomials and quadrinomials using grouping. So quadrinomials would be 4 terms, and then trinomials would be 3 terms. And we must factor 4 terms with grouping, but trinomials we have some other options. But I'm going to show you tonight this last one in case you need another method. Some students don't like slide and divide, so I want to give you a third method. And so, but when we have 4 terms that we have to factor by grouping, our steps, I want to have you go ahead and write down, take a minute to pause the video and write down our steps for grouping. Okay, let's work through these steps with the first problem. So our first step is to group pairs based on the greatest common factor. And I want you to think about what is screaming at you in common. At this point in your factoring, you should be thinking about the greatest common factor as what do you see that's in common? It should be screaming at you at this point. So if I look at these 4 terms, I could rearrange them in different orders, but I think I'm going to keep them in the order that they are. Because right now these 3 and the 21 is screaming at me that they both have a common factor of 3, and then 2 and 14 have a common factor of 2. So I like the order it's in. We could rearrange it, but I'm going to go ahead and leave it in the order it's in. So once you've decided, you go ahead and group them using parentheses. And once you've written down your 2 sets of pairs, then we're going to be factoring out the greatest common factor from both pairs. So they'll be different what's in common on your 2 sets of pairs. So first I'll look at my first pair, and not only do they have a 3 in common, but they also have an x squared in common. So I'll factor out the 3 and the x squared. And then remember, we would divide each thing. Remember what factoring means. It means divide the 3x squared out from each item. So 3x cubed divided by 3x squared would be x. And 21x squared divided by 3x squared would be negative 7. So negative 21x squared divided by 3x squared would be negative 7. Always before you go on, you multiply to check. Okay, it looks good. Now I'm going to factor out a 2 from our common factor of 2x and negative 14. So we leave the plus in between the 2 sets, and I'll show you why in a minute, but make sure you leave the plus in between. And right here I'm just factoring out a 2. And if I divide 2 out from 2x, I get x. If I divide 2 out from negative 14, I get minus 7. Okay, so that's the second step. Our third step is if what is the same in the parentheses, then we're going to move on to step 4. So this is our check here. If it's not, then we're going to go back to step 1. So let me fix that here. Alright, so in the parentheses we have an x minus 7 and an x minus 7. So that is the same. So we're going to go ahead and move on to step 4. If this was not the case, that means we have to start again. This is the whole goal here. You want what's in this parentheses here to be the same. Now that you've done that, now you're going to factor out x minus 7 from each. So you take that x minus 7 and factor it out. And if I factor x minus 7 from this term here, I'll have 3x squared. If I factor out x minus 7 from this term, I'll be left with 2. And that's our final factored answer, and all we have to do is multiply to check. And with grouping, you actually can just multiply by looking at your problem, so you should, and you don't have to write them out. You're welcome to, but you don't have to, because there won't be any like terms typically. There could be, but when you multiply to check, you look at your first terms, and that'd be 3x cubed. Then our outside would be positive 2x, which is here, and then our inside is minus 21x squared, which is here, and our last is minus 14. So you checked it. Okay, let's try number 2. And I already like the pairs that it set up at what's screaming at you in common. Right here, these pairs, I can see they have an x squared in common, and then here we have a negative 3. So I'm going to go ahead and with step 1, and I'm going to group them in the order they are. So I have a pairs of x cubed plus x squared and a negative 3x minus 3. And every time you group your pairs, make sure there's a plus sign in the middle. Now I'm going to factor out my greatest common factor from both pairs. So go ahead and pause the video and try that. Okay, you should have gotten x squared as your greatest common factor in this first one. And inside would be x plus 1. Then remember, you keep this plus sign and you're looking at the greatest common factor in your second pair, and that would be negative 3 in this case. That's what they have in common. And again, if I divide negative 3 out from both of those, it would be x plus 1. Okay, so then we look at number 3 step, and if what's in the parentheses is the same, then we move on to step 4. And we met our goal, x plus 1 is the same. So now we go on to step 4. That step says to factor out what is the same. So I'm going to go ahead and factor them out. And our leftovers here are x squared minus 3 are what's left. So I factor out x plus 1, then I have x squared minus 3. Now we multiply to check. Go ahead and pause the video and multiply to check. Okay, so you should have multiplied and to check and verified that you factored it correctly. So our answer of x plus 1 times x squared minus 3 is correct. All right, let's go ahead and try a couple, or try 3. The first thing I want you to see is for number 1 here, that you can keep them in the same order and group them in the same order that they're in. Or if you felt like you thought the 2's were screaming at you more and the 3's were screaming at you more, you could change the order. And remember, that is the commutative property, and you can change the order around. So we can put 8x near 2x to the 4th and the negative 12 near the negative 3x cubed. And then follow the steps of factoring out, or step 2 of factoring out the greatest common factor. Okay, go ahead and try number 1. Okay, so depending on which one you decided that you thought it was easier to find the greatest common factor, if you chose this one, then you would have found that you factored out the x cubed in this first pair, and the 4 in the second pair, and you would have uncovered that they have a common factor of 2x minus 3, and then that would be multiplied by x cubed plus 4. If you chose this order of the terms, then you would have factored out 2x from your first pair and a minus 3 from your second pair, and you would get the same answer for the factored problem. Okay, for number 2, notice that they have a greatest common factor. So first, before we do our grouping, we have to factor out our greatest common factor of 2. So each item we're going to divide out 2. Then we're going to need to do grouping. So this 2 is going to come down with our grouping the entire time. And remember, it just comes along the outside. I'm going to go ahead and erase that arrow I drew, but just wanted you to realize it's going to come down as you do the grouping for the 4 terms inside. So the 2 is going to get written each time, each line we're going to write that. But now we're going to look at our order. You can change your order if the 3's are screaming at you, or you can leave them in this order, depending on what you like. I'm going to go ahead and leave them in that order. And again, I'm going to leave this 2 out on the outside. So what they have in common, this pair has an x squared in common. When I factor out the x squared, I see it's x minus 3. Here, x minus 3, they don't have anything in common. It's already factored out a 1 that's in common. And you can see that our goal of getting this at the same has already been met. And you can place a 1 here to help you remember that that would be part of your second term when you factor out x minus 3. So now we're going to factor out that x minus 3. And our last factor will be x squared plus 1. Okay, go ahead and pause the video and try one more, number 3 here, and then I'm going to show you how to use it with trinomials for another method. Okay, so your last problem, number 3, for the 4 terms, you should have factored out and gotten 2x plus 3 times 2x cubed minus 3. This last example I added on was to give you another way to factor the trinomials. Go ahead and pause the video and write down these steps, and then I'll walk through the problem. Okay, so our first step is similar to slide and divide, but I think it's a little less complicated. You'll have to let me know in class. But first we're going to multiply a times our c. So remember what a is. It's our number in front of our, this is an a, so ax squared plus bx plus c. So our a here gets multiplied by our c, so in this case 6 times 24. So if I determine AC, it's 24. Then I determine what factors of AC sum to b. Our b here is negative 11. So when I think about 24, I can think of 6 and 4, 8 and 3, 12 and 2, and 24 and 1. But they have to add up to negative 11. So I know they have to both be negative, and they're the only ones that are going to work that add up to negative 11 are negative 8 and negative 3. Once I've made that decision, now I can ungroup this middle term so that I can do grouping. So we're going to separate negative 11x and make it negative 8x and negative 3x. So the first term stays the same. And then we break up the negative 11x. And now we're going to factor by grouping. So go ahead and factor and bring it back. So when you factor by grouping, you get 3x minus 4 times 2x minus 1. Anytime you're factoring, you look for patterns and use your flow chart. If you'd like more practice for the quiz next class, please watch